Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another of the series of videos where I'm going over the regions of Canada and the 2025 election and how things have changed in them. So, today we are doing Atlantic Canada, and fortunately, since the last time I have done this, Elections Canada has published the poll-by-poll results, and people have taken the gracious time to map these poll-by-poll results so we can actually see poll-by-poll in a nice graphical format what the 2025 election result was. This particular one is from Kyle J. Hutton. So if you ever see him in the wild, you know where to find the thank for him. That I don't know the best way to, I guess this link up here is the link you would go to if you want to go on this, if you can read this, I don't know. But anyways, before I begin on the main meat and potatoes of the video, I want to once again shout out my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and by all means, if you like the work, want to support the work I do here, go in the link in the description below and press that join button. Otherwise, do your regular YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But with that, let us begin. So, prior to this last election, I frequently would say that Atlantic Canada is going to move to the right. Now, some people have since criticized my comments like that by pointing out that, oh, well, the Conservatives didn't win net seats in the Atlantic. In fact, they lost South Shore St. Margaret's and Cumberland Colchester. They did gain 2 in Newfoundland, though, one of which being razor thin. But I think that kind of misses the actual underlying trends at the bottom level for the macro level things. Now, I don't have a nice 2021 map to show you, but I have a sort of thing to show you. Now, this next map, I'm going to show you this from Elections Atlas, is not as nice. It's not as clean. It's not as easy to understand, but hey, that's what we got. So I can expand this for other provinces, but we're going to just use Nova Scotia as the baseline for the first point. So this is 2025 results. And you can see places like, say, this part of King's Hants. Joel Hurdle, 107 to Cody Blois, 86 votes. There we go. We go back to 2021, and you can kind of see a similar, you see the same map. So there's a big difference between these two maps. Like, for example, look at King's Hants here. 2021. Actually, what am I doing? Let's open this up in a second. We're going to do a little side by side. Those will be easier. Woohoo. Okay. Why is this being weird? Right, pull it. Here we go. You can kind of see the difference here. It's not, again, this is not the best way to show it, but you can sort of see like some of these rural precincts here start flipping conservative. A lot of precincts in this, I'll add this one here, in like this general vicinity flip conservative. So you kind of get the idea with just this writing. There's a bunch of areas. It's also easily seeable in Central Nova. Look at a lot of the area in New Glasgow region, this eastern shore part of Nova Scotia, around Antigonish area a little bit. A lot of these precincts flipped conservative. Again, we can go into Cape Breton area, and you can see, yes, some areas, such as Ingles Bay, also went more conservative. But others, say, around Sydney, didn't really move too much. But there is, generally speaking, a lot more blue in the rurals on this last election. PEI is another good one. You can kind of see the difference here. A lot more blue in the rurals. Egmont is actually a really good example. This whole tip basically flipped blue. And again, I could keep going on. We're just going to run with this. But the general gist here, if you again look at a poll-by-poll map in the province, the Conservatives won a huge swath more geography. Now, some people will reply to saying, oh, the Conservatives won a huge amount more geography in the Atlantic Canada with, oh, but land doesn't vote, people vote. But they also won a lot more votes. And now this is where my favorite thing ever comes in, spreadsheets, the greatest invention man has ever made. You can see here, very clearly, the Conservatives gained 165,000 votes. This is the gains, 2025 to 2021. Here, well, we'll just call it gains. They gained 165,000 votes. And that's 110,000 more than 2011. And 120,000 more than 2006. It's even more votes than PCs plus Reform got in 1997 by about 44,000. Now, the Liberals also gained more votes, about 270,000 more votes. But a lot of this is at the expense of the NDP and the Greens. Now, yes, some of these PPC votes went to the Conservatives. But if we can assume, obviously this is simplifying, some dippers went Conservative, some Conservatives went Liberal, some Liberals went Conservative, etc., etc. But if we not simplify for a moment, and you just say Liberals, NDP, Green as the general left, they get about 110,000 votes. Conservatives, PPC as the general right, they get 123,000 more votes. And if we go even one election back to 2019, you see here, let's just clean this up. It'll be a little easier to read this. The Liberals, Greens, and NDP collectively actually have 32,000 fewer votes in 2025 than they did in 2019. They are up from 2021, but that is really because 2021 is a particularly low turnout election. As you see in the Atlantic region, you see here 101.3 million 2015-2019, 1.4 million 2025. This was only 1.9 million, or sorry, 1.19 million, sorry, which is quite low. That's almost the same level as 2011. And I don't think there's been population growth, but there has been an increased people who were actually, like, the voting age population's increased, even though the population itself is mostly the same. Fewer kids, more adults, basically. So this is quite notable. There is a higher amount of voters in this last election than the last three. And the Liberals actually have, the left generally has fewer votes than they did in the last three. And you can kind of see there's a bit of a trend. Now, it is up from 2021, but not by that much. The Conservatives and the general right are significantly up. And you can kind of see, again, this in the simplified left-right graph over here. This is the best performance for the general right in Canada since 2004. Best performance ever for the Conservative Party itself. So, again, we can pretty clearly see the Conservatives did do better in this region. But why didn't they win? Well, or why didn't they gain seats? Well, this number's down here. It's kind of what the gist here is. So, in this last election, the Liberals got the left got 866,000 votes. If we just divide the Liberal vote by that, you can see the Liberals won 91% of all the votes the left got in the last election. The left received. If you average these last four elections, the Liberals only received an average of 73% of the vote. So, while there isn't an increase in turnout for the general left, the Liberals, NDP, the Greens collectively do not actually have more voters than they normally do. This is a below average performance for the last decade for them. This is overcompensated by the Liberals by them just dominating the center-left vote. They monopolized it. Now, I think this monopolization factor, where the Liberals dominate this vote, is going to stay true as long as Mark Carney is the leader of the Liberal Party. It will be the next leader before we can really see this change. Now, we could see the overall left-wing vote decline maybe, or more conservatives vote, or the conservative vote share increase, because even this 1.4 million is not 100% turnout. I think it's only in the 70% range. So we could see more turnout, leading to more conservative votes. We could see the left turnout decrease. Again, it could go 100,000 lower, and that would not be unprecedented for the last decade. But we are likely to see it be this strongly monopolized. But that's not the only interesting detail we have. We can actually look at the different sub-regions of the Atlantic. So I will be just a little brief with these. No, we're going to do it this way. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, going to make a new column so we can all read that. Because for some reason, my screen share always cuts the left corner of my screen. I could probably adjust that in OBS, but who cares? I don't care. Sorry, guys. Your boy does not care. So we have these regions in Atlantic Canada. We have rural Newfoundland. We have the Avalon Peninsula, PEI, rural Nova Scotia, Halifax, Anglo New Brunswick, and Franco New Brunswick. Now, let us go back forward to this so we can understand this a bit better. Can we go to... We don't. Is there a good way to see this? Not on this one. That's fine. So, the Avalon Peninsula is roughly, the riding of Avalon here, St. John's East and Cape Spear. Rural Newfoundland is Terra Nova, the Peninsula's Central Newfoundland, Long Range Mountains, and Labrador. Halifax is Halifax West, Sackville, Bedford, Preston, and Dartmouth, Cole Harbour. The rest is rural Nova Scotia. Anglo New Brunswick is Fundy Royal, St. John Kanapakis, St. John St. Croix, Fredericton, Oromocto, Tobiquik, Mactaquac, and Miramichi, Grand Lake. I understand for those people from New Brunswick or familiar with demographics in New Brunswick that say this part of Miramichi, Grand Lake has a lot of Acadians in it. But I had to classify the writing somewhere, and it's more Anglo than it is Franco, so it had to go somewhere. If I wanted to be more fine grain, I would cut out a lot of the coastline here. That's very Acadian, especially this pocket of this red pocket here is where a lot of Acadians live, unsurprisingly. And New Brunswick Acadians tend to vote very left-wing, or very liberal partisanly, not left-wing per se. They're very partisan liberals. But, again, my numbers are grouping by riding. Now, Franco, New Brunswick would be Madawaska, Restigouche, Acadie, Bathurst, Beausejour, and Moncton, Dieppe. Though I will note, you can even see inside the Franco regions, a lot of these precincts are being won by Conservatives. And if we go to 2021... sorry, I should have had this prepped a bit better, but whatever. Again, I don't really care. The prep doesn't get more views, to be honest. The more prep. If it did, I would do it more, but it doesn't. You can kind of see, in this general vicinity, these are all still going... some of these are pretty close. This one's only a 2-vote gap. But you still have a lot of these are now blue. They were red over here. Some of them are still blue, but many are red. We'll go back here. Now, I don't know why that's doing that. Okay, there we go. I got rid of that annoying graphical issue. So, if we compare 2021 to 2025 for vote share and raw votes, we can see in every part of the province, or the region, the Conservatives gain vote share, particularly Franco New Brunswick and Halifax, and to a lesser extent, rural Newfoundland. The areas where the Conservatives are strongest traditionally, rural Nova Scotia and Anglo New Brunswick, they actually do the least better. The lowest increase in performance. And if we go by raw votes, the Conservatives are getting 55, 56% in Newfoundland, 87 in Franco New Brunswick, 122 in Halifax. Now, this is partially a result of there being no Conservative candidate in Halifax, Dartmouth Coal Harbour in 2021. But even if we assume that there was one, and let's say they got 9,000 votes, which is a pretty reasonable typical number that the Conservatives would get in Dartmouth Coal Harbour, then you still get a 71% change. And if we ignore Dartmouth altogether, it's about 47% if it's just looking at the three: Sackville, Bedford, Preston, Halifax West, and Halifax. So just those three, it's about a 45% improvement. If we include Dartmouth, it's about 71% with a synthetic candidate. And if we just do it as it is, it's 122. So pretty big improvement. The Conservatives are actually gaining ground in some of the places where they're traditionally the weakest. Rural Newfoundland, Halifax, and Franklin, New Brunswick are the three regions the Conservatives are traditionally the weakest in Atlantic Canada. Though these days, Avalon Peninsula is one of their weakest regions, and rural Newfoundland is one of their better ones. But that's pretty recent. If we actually look here at the rural Newfoundland data, let's zoom in real quick. Okay. Oop. So in rural Newfoundland, it's pretty rare that the Conservatives actually got or received much more than 20% of the vote, or 30% of the vote. Like 13, 29, 14, 27, 22, 18. Yes, they have a 37. Yes, they have a 35. But that's pretty anomalous. The average over the last, 11 elections is 27% for the Conservatives. 28% if we include the PPC as a right-wing generalist. That's pretty bad historically, but here they got 50%, 41% in 2021. So things are significantly changing in this region. And in fact, for the first time ever, or at least in these 11 elections, the general right won a majority of the vote in rural Newfoundland. Conversely, the Avalon Peninsula, I touched on this briefly in my Newfoundland postmortem. The Avalon Peninsula used to be very strongly conservative, and it was similarly with the PCs provincially. We're seeing 42, 45, 56, 37, 48. Those are pretty strong performances. It's around 2008 that things collapsed, partially to things Stephen Harper did and said, partially some incumbents retired or left the party. These incumbents that were polling these numbers in Avalon Peninsula, these were from the PC wing of the right. For the most part, there was almost zero. I mean, you can see here there was very few reform votes in the region. And since then, they've done pretty bad. Though 29% is still an improvement. It's the best performance since they collapsed in Avalon Peninsula. But let's get back to the main discussion here. It's not just, though, that the Conservatives did better, or the right did better than 2021. They also did better than their best election on record under the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, I specify that because obviously the PC party and Reform are dead and they're gone. So comparing back to, say, 2000 or 1997, those are better elections, but they were fought with different parties. So they're not really comparable to the most recent ones. And you could really kind of say that 1997 is pretty much an anomaly. This is the worst Liberal performance other than 2011. But I digress. But if we compare to 2011 as a base point, we see the same kind of trend popping up with Anglo New Brunswick and rural Nova Scotia being actually worse. The Conservatives have done worse in those two regions. Though part of this is not that they did worse in votes. As you can see here, they got 22% more votes, 9% more votes. It's that the left has actually had more turnout in these regions. And I'll touch on Anglo New Brunswick momentarily, but for rural Nova Scotia, where I am very familiar with, a lot of this is very likely that it'll be easy to show this graphically. this region here, and to a lesser extent, Amherst up here, and places like Truro or the Annapolis Valley, King County, I guess I should say, Windsor area. These are places where there's been a lot of people moving either back to Nova Scotia from who were here originally but left, or have just moved here since COVID and have retired here. There's a lot of people retiring to this part of the province, a lot of people retiring to this part of the province, a lot of people retiring to places like Amherst and Truro. And a lot of these retirees vote Liberal. That's pretty much what it is. A lot of these areas have basically had a big import of people who tend to vote Liberal. They don't, I would say, on average, they don't vote. But when they do vote, they seem to vote Liberal. But that's a digression. Anglo New Brunswick has a completely different explanation, which I'll get into momentarily. Now, we also see PEI is a worse performance, but I feel like that's probably just an anomaly. I don't really have a good explanation for why the Conservatives did worse in PEI in 2025 than they did in 2011. Other than potentially, again, arguing that the Liberals did better, which is what the point with rural Nova Scotia was. But again, here though, we see Avalon, slight increase in vote share, but a big increase in votes. Franco New Brunswick, small increase in vote share, big increase in votes. Huge stumping increase in votes and a huge stumping increase in vote share in rural Newfoundland. And again, a relatively strong improvement in Halifax. Now, if you compare the general left, the Liberals, NDP, Greens, 2021 to 25, they lost ground in every region except Anglo New Brunswick, which I'll get into momentarily again. Though they did gain votes, because remember, as I touched on in the previous section, the Liberal or the left-wing turnout decreased in 2021, probably because of COVID, and it has rebounded since then. So 2021 was a bad baseline year to compare left-wing performance to. So 2025 looks like a good overperformance. If you actually compare this to, say, 2015, their best year for the left on record, in the period where the Conservative Party exists, they do worse in every single region, and they lose vote share in every single region, with just Halifax, PEI, and Anglo New Brunswick being somewhat tolerable. I guess you could say Avalon somewhat tolerable too. But rural Newfoundland, rural Nova Scotia, and Franco New Brunswick are huge decreases in vote share. And big decreases, they are big decreases in vote share, but they're also big decreases in raw votes. But now let's discuss Anglo New Brunswick. And Anglo New Brunswick is interesting. It's the one region the left did better in vote share. It's one of only two regions where the left actually gained a substantial, or one of three regions, where the left gained a substantial number of new voters. Rural Nova Scotia, which I already touched on, is one, and Avalon is another. It's also, Anglo New Brunswick, the only region where the Conservatives did somewhat mediocre in vote share, but also had a substantial decrease in vote share from 2011. So why might that be? We zoom in here. This tells us a lot, I think. So this is Quispamsis. I think I pronounced that wrong. I apologize to New Brunswickers. It's kind of a funny name. It's probably pronounced more obviously than I think it is, but oh well. This Quispamsis, or however you pronounce this, Bamsis? I don't know. This was Blaine Higgs' seat. Now, notably, Blaine Higgs lost re-election about 6 months before this election. He lost his own seat in a blowout. Places like St. John moved significantly to the left. This was once the most conservative part of New Brunswick provincially, and it went almost all Liberal in the election. Fredericton moved substantially as well. And if we go back to comparing this side by side for a second, we compare this to Go to this 2025. Compare this to this. And you can see in like places like I cannot pronounce this. Quispamsis. I don't know. Again, it's all I know. This was a lot bluer. There's a big, very big change. And you can also, a little bit, it looks in some places better in this area. But turnout in some of these core areas, like, for example, pole 122 is 135 to 48. And let's see if we can find... That's too hard to find. Let's just... again, you can look at this yourself manually. I don't want to try to find polls to compare. Cause, oh, wait, I had it right here. Well, I can't find it. Oh, wait, there we go. Yeah, so you can see here, so is 55 to 27, and then over here... It was like 135 to 48. So there is a substantial increase in turnout in a lot of these polls. Some of them did go blue that were red before. Some of the ones that were blue, though, over here, went red. But a lot of this there's a very big increase in turnout and voters in the core of St. John, in the core of Fredericton, that did not vote before. And I think the reason for that is it's backlash from the Higgs government onto the federal Conservative Party. And I think that is one of the big reasons you don't see a big overperformance for the Conservatives in St. John, Kennebacus, and Fredericton or Mukdo. You also see places like Grand Lake being quite close, which again is kind of a similar deal. Now, this isn't a generalized backlash to Higgs, because places, the Franco Party in Brunswick does a lot better for the Conservatives. But I think these specific areas, Fredericton and St. John, did swing against the Conservatives more than you would expect them to have. Sort of because of aftermath of the contempt and dislike of Higgs. They did resoundingly reject him in the last election, so I think that is the big cause. Unlike, say, rural Nova Scotia, where I think a lot of this changes. For example, like, look at some of these precincts here in St. Margaret's Bay, like 70-60% Liberals. We get this guy. Oh, I zoomed way too far. Again, I wish I had two of the other one because it's a slightly better map, but you see here, like, a lot of these are a lot closer. We're looking at, like, there's some still in the 70 range, but a lot of these are closer to parity, and the overall turnout per precinct is also lower as well. So what you generally speaking have, what we can draw from all the data I've just shouted at you over the course of this video, the region has moved to the right. The rural areas have drifted to the right. Some small towns have moved, or in some of the small cities have moved to the left, which is why some things have treaded water since then. But you see big gains in PEI, you see big gains in central Nova Scotia, in King's Hants even, though in the rurals, not in the cities. And you still see the Conservatives doing fine in places like the South Shore, for the most part. And obviously rural New Brunswick, where they still are comfortably putting out 60-70% in a lot of these ridings. And they also do substantially better in Newfoundland itself, rural Newfoundland itself. I don't think it is safe to, or I don't think we can generalize this to say that the Conservatives are going to win all of Atlantic Canada anytime soon, or that they're going to have potential to gain dozens of seats. But I do think this trend will continue. And one of the reasons for that is this trend has been continuing for years. The last 4 elections, every single one, even if we want to include the PPC, has been an improvement for the general right, and specifically the Conservative Party. And if we look at the preceding years under the Harper term, there is a decrease here because of particular actions, but overall, that's 2008 to 11 is still an improvement in raw votes, for example, and 2006 to 2011 is still an improvement. Now, Harper kind of screwed the pooch in 2015, which really reset the Conservatives here by a lot. But between the changing demographics in the region, people aging, and the changing age structure and age pyramid of the region, plus the changing political dynamics of the world, and the fact that the Conservative Party is tending to be more culturally conservative and less focused on cutting spending at the price of everything else, does seem to be paying off, and I think the region will keep moving to the right as long as that is the case. Atlantic Canada, especially rural Atlantic Canada, is very conservative culturally, but they're not necessarily the type of small government, prairie type conservatives. The term PC versus reform conservative, I think those are terrible terms and they're not very descriptive, but it does kind of capture something that is true and underlying, which is there's a difference between blue quadrant and purple quadrant conservatives. And in this particular case, Atlantic Canada is much more purple quadrant types. They are not this small government, tiny little government types. They want a government that backs them, the communitarian, that kind of such. I just found the graphic here. 1 second. Whoop. Here we go. Atlantic Canada fits more in this bracket. Maybe you could say some people here are like this. Whereas the Western Canada, the prairies, are much closer to this blue quadrant. And the alliance between this blue quadrant and this purple quadrant, again, is what the Conservatives need to do if they want to actually win elections. But you saw that in my video about party factions, which, if you haven't seen that, you should go check it out. But with that, though, I'll bid you guys all adieu, and I'll see you back next week with something else.